In the spring of 1887, in the failing silver town of Cedar Hollow in the Idaho Territory, a girl of 18 stood at the edge of a sheriff's sale and laid down a single silver dollar for a thing no grown man in that crowd would have carried home for free. The thing was a root cellar. Not a house, not a claim, not a wagon. A hole in the ground behind a burned-out cabin, its timber roof half collapsed, its stone steps running down into black water that had stood there, by the assessor's own grumbling estimate, for the better part of 9 years. The auctioneer had laughed when she raised her hand. He had asked her not unkindly whether she understood that she could not drink a flooded cellar, could not plow it, could not sell it back to a soul. She had answered that she understood it well enough. She had her dollar in her glove, and her mind already past him, fixed on the dark square of water below, and she did not yet know that what lay drowned beneath that surface would undo a man who had never once thought of her, and would give her back a name she had been taught to be ashamed of. Her name was Della Hart, and the town knew her, when it troubled to know her at all, as the Hart girl whose father had hanged himself in debt. That was the shape of her in the public mind, and shapes like that are hard to move. Stay with me through what the water hid, because the cellar she bought for $1 held more truth than the whole courthouse above it. Della had come to that morning's sale with $4 to her name, and she walked away with $3. She had eaten little for 2 days. She slept in the loft of a livery stable that the owner, a tired old man named Otis Pratt, let her use in exchange for forking hay and mucking stalls before the sun came up. She owned a change of clothes, a comb, her mother's wedding ring on a string around her neck, and one thing more, which was the only thing in the world she truly valued. It was a set of locksmith's tools, rolled in oiled canvas, picks and tension wrenches, and a small steel hook worn smooth at the grip, and they had belonged to the only person who had ever taught her anything worth keeping. That person was her grandfather, Silas Crane, dead 2 winters now, who in his life had been the locksmith and safe man for half the mining country between the Salmon River and the Snake. Silas had no son, and his daughter, Della's mother, had married badly and died young, so it was Della he had taken into his shop as a child. Della he had set on a stool beside the bench, Della he had taught to listen. He used to say that a lock was not a wall, but a conversation. He used to say that every maker left his fingerprints inside the works, in the spacing of the pins, in the cut of the levers, in the small private habits of his hand, and that if you learned to read those habits you could open anything a man had built to keep you out. Most people, he told her, look at a lock and see a refusal. A locksmith sees a question waiting to be answered. She had been 12 when he first said it. She had carried it like a coal in her chest ever since. What drew her to the flooded cellar was not the cellar, it was the door. She had seen it 3 days before the sale, when she went out past the burned cabin to gather wild onions on land nobody watched. The cabin had belonged to a freighter named August Reyes, who had died in the same hard winter that took her grandfather, and his small holding had reverted to the county for unpaid tax. Picking through the weeds, she had come to the cellar mouth and looked down the stone steps into still black water, and there, just beneath the surface where the water met the far wall, she had seen the top edge of a door. Not a cellar's plank hatch. An iron door, the kind of door a man does not put on a vegetable cellar. The kind of door her grandfather had hung on bank vaults and assay offices and the strong rooms of freight companies that moved gold dust down out of the hills. An iron door, sunk and drowned, set into the back wall of a hole in the ground that the whole town had written off as worthless. She had knelt at the top of those steps for a long while, and she had felt the old coal in her chest catch and glow. So she bought it. $1, and the auctioneer's joke, and the slow turning away of men who had better things to think about than a half-starved girl and her flooded hole. None of them had seen the door. None of them had thought to wade down those steps into cold standing water, to feel along a wall nobody believed held anything but mud. They saw a refusal. she had been taught to see a question. The first thing the question required was that she get the water out, and that was not the work of an afternoon. The cellar was sunk 11 feet into a hillside, and the water stood near to the third step from the top, which, by her reckoning, meant something better than 1,000 gallons of cold black standing water between her and the door she meant to open. She had no pump. A pump cost more than she would see in a year. What she had was a wooden bucket borrowed from Otis Pratt, a length of rope, and a back that did not yet know how tired it could be made. She began on a Monday. She rigged the rope over the half-fallen roof beam, looped it so a full bucket would not pull her down the steps, and she hauled. She filled the bucket below, climbed the slick stone steps, swung it clear of the mouth, emptied it into the weeds, and went down again. She counted at first to give her mind something to hold, and she lost the count somewhere past 200 and did not start it over. The water did not seem to drop at all the first day. Her palms blistered and the blisters broke, and she wrapped them in rag and kept on. At dusk she could not close her hands. She had thought going in that the labor would be the simple part, the dull part. The price a body paid to reach the interesting work below. She learned otherwise by the second morning. The cold water numbed her legs to the knee within the hour, so that climbing the steps became a matter of watching her own feet to be sure they had landed where she meant them to. The bucket, full, weighed near to 40 pounds, and 40 pounds lifted 300 times is a different number than 40 pounds lifted once. She found a rhythm at last, not of speed, but of endurance, the rhythm her grandfather had used at the forge, where a man does not strike hard but strikes the same, hour after hour, and lets the sameness do the work that strength alone cannot. Down, fill, climb, swing, empty, down. She stopped thinking of it as bailing a cellar. She thought of it as keeping time. She ate what she could afford, which was little hard bread and a strip of dried beef and water from the town pump, and she slept those nights like a dropped stone and woke before light with her hands curled into claws that took a quarter hour by the stove to open. Otis Pratt watched her come and go and said nothing for 3 days, which from Otis was a kind of respect, and on the 4th morning he set a tin of bacon grease by the loft ladder without a word for her hands, and she understood the gift and used it and did not embarrass him by thanking him aloud. A boy watched her from the road that first evening, a freckled boy of 9 or 10 named Toby, who belonged to the woman who ran the boarding house, and he asked her what she was doing. She told him she was emptying a cellar. He asked why. She said because there was a door at the bottom of it. He thought about that the way children think, with his whole face, and then he ran off, and she supposed he had gone to tell his mother that the Hart girl had finally lost her senses. He came back, though. He came back the next evening and the one after, and on the 3rd he brought a smaller bucket of his own, and asked very seriously whether he might help, and she let him carry the half-loads up while she carried the full ones, and the work went a little faster for it, and neither of them spoke much. By the 3rd day, the town had a joke, and the joke was her. The men at the mercantile had it that she was bailing the Reyes hole with a bucket, and they laughed the easy laugh of men who have never wanted a thing so badly they would empty a flood by hand to reach it. The assayer's clerk, a soft pale man named Marcus Pinch, made a remark at the counter loud enough for her to hear when she came in for a fresh coil of rope, something about the high price of mud these days, and the men laughed, and she paid for her rope and said nothing, and went back to her bucket. Her grandfather had taught her that too. He had said that a workman who answers every fool wastes the breath he needs for the work. So she spent her breath on the work. The water dropped. By the 4th day she could see it dropping, a dark ring left on the stone wall marking where it had stood, then a second ring below the first. By the 6th day, the iron door stood clear of the water, to the height of its great central lock, and she came down the steps in the gray light of morning, and stood in mud to her ankles and looked at it full for the first time, and she knew her grandfather's work when she saw it, the way a daughter knows a father's handwriting. It was his. There was no question in her of doubt. The door was a crane door. She knew the hinge work, the riveting, the particular squared shoulders of the frame her grandfather had forged or commissioned for 30 years. She had seen a dozen like it in her childhood, standing in banks and company offices across the territory. One never, though, had she known him to hang one in the ground behind a freighter's burned cabin. And that was the first true mystery, deeper than the water. Why had Silas Crane built a vault door for August Reyes, and why had no one in 9 years come to open it? The lock was ruined by the water. That much she understood within the first hour of trying. The mechanism had stood drowned for the better part of a decade, and rust had welded the levers into a single dead mass that no key on earth would turn. Now, supposing a key still existed, a lesser hand would have given up there or gone for a sledge, and a sledge would have done nothing against 800 pounds of iron but break the hand that swung it. Della had not come to break the door. She had come to read it. She remembered a thing her grandfather had told her near the end, when his hands had grown too unsteady to work, and he passed his knowing to her in words because he could no longer pass it in deeds. He had said that every door he ever built had a second way in, known to him alone, because a locksmith who cannot get past his own work is a fool who has locked himself out of his own life. He called it the Maker's Path. Not a weakness, he said, for a thief could never find it, having not built the thing. A courtesy the Maker pays himself. She had asked him where the Maker's Path lay on his doors, and he had smiled and said that it lay wherever the eye does not go, and that she would know it when she stopped looking at the lock and started looking at the man. So she stopped looking at the lock. For 2 days she did almost nothing but study the door by lantern light, running her rapt fingers over every rivet and seam, mapping it the way her grandfather had taught her to map a strange mechanism before ever touching a pick to it. She brought the lantern down each morning and set it on the driest step, and sat before the iron, as a person sits before a hard letter. They mean to read all the way through. She traced the hinges. She traced the frame where it bedded into the stone, feeling for the small irregularities that a maker's hand leaves and a machine does not. She pressed her ear to the cold iron and tapped along it with the steel hook, listening to the change in the sound where the metal was solid and where it was not, the way her grandfather had taught her to find the hollow behind a wall. The work was slow, and it looked to anyone who might have watched like a girl doing nothing at all in a muddy hole. She knew better. Looking was the work. The hands came after. She found it on the second evening. Oh, on the right side, where the frame met the stone, 3 rivet heads stood very slightly proud of the iron, and they were set in a pattern she had seen before, not on a door but on the back of her grandfather's own tool chest, 3 points like the corners of a narrow triangle. She had opened that chest 1,000 times as a child, and the catch on its false back had been her grandfather's small, private joke, a thing he showed her the day she turned 10 and made her promise never to tell. She had thought it only a clever box. She understood now that it had been a lesson, left where a child would carry it without knowing she carried it against a day exactly like this one. She pressed the rivet heads in the order the chest had taught her, low, high, low, and something behind the iron gave with a sound like a held breath let go, and a narrow panel at the base of the door, no wider than her 2 hands, swung inward into darkness. The cold air came out first, cold air, and a smell of dust, and old paper, and the particular dead stillness of a place that has been sealed away from the turning of the world. She knelt in the mud and put the lantern through the gap, and she saw that the water had never reached inside. The flood had drowned the steps and the door's face, but the chamber beyond sat above the water line, dry as the day it was closed, and what it held had waited 9 years in the dark for a hand that knew the way in. The lantern light moved over it slowly, and the dust hung in the beam where her breath disturbed it, 9 years of settled dust that had known no breath until hers, and she stayed very still and let her eyes learn the shape of what she had found. What she saw she did not understand at once. She would spend the rest of the night and much of the year understanding it. The chamber was small, a stone-lined room no bigger than a pantry, and it was not empty. Against the far wall stood a freighter's strong-box, iron-bound, its lid up, and inside the strong-box, stacked and tied with wax string, sat ledgers, not gold, not coin. Ledgers, a dozen of them and more, the account books of a freight and assay business, and laid across the top of them a packet of letters and a single folded document sealed with wax. There were other things in the chamber, a man's coat on a peg, a pair of good boots, a tin of tobacco gone to powder, the small leavings of a life interrupted. Yet it was the ledgers her eye came back to, because across the spine of the topmost one, in a hand she did not yet know, someone had written a name she knew very well. The name was Halloran. Everyone in Cedar Hollow knew the name Halloran. Josiah Halloran owned the bank, owned the assay scales, owned the freight contracts and the water rights, and the better part of the mortgages in the county, and what he did not own, he held a note against. He had come into the country, poor men said, 20 years back, and built himself up by hard work and harder dealing, and if some of that dealing had been sharp, well, the country was sharp, and a man took what he could hold. That was the story Josiah Halloran had built around himself, and, like the shape the town had built around Della, it was hard to move, because no one had ever had cause to move it. The ledgers were August Reyes's ledgers. Della understood that much by the second night sitting in the livery loft with the topmost book open across her knees and a stub of candle burning down. Reyes had been a freighter, and a careful one, and he had kept his accounts in a small, crabbed, honest hand, every load and every fee and every dollar owed and paid. And running through those accounts like a vein of ore through rock was the long quarrel of his life, which was with Josiah Halloran, who for 9 years before his death had been slowly and lawfully and ruinously squeezing August Reyes off the freight roads he had built. She read by candlelight until the candle was a puddle, and then she read by the next one, and Otis Pratt found her at it in the gray of the morning, and said nothing, and left a tin cup of coffee at the top of the ladder. The hardest pages to read were not the figures. They were the margins where Reyes had let himself be a man, and not only an accountant, where he had written beside a column of stolen dollars, that he did not know how much longer he could hold on, and beside another, that if anything happened to him the truth was behind Crane's iron, and someone would find it some day, and he hoped to God that person was braver than the country he had lived in. Della read that line 3 times. Then she closed the book and sat in the dark a while, and she understood that the door had been waiting not for a thief and not for an heir, but for exactly the thing she was, a patient hand that knew how to read. She did not have the whole of it yet, she had pieces. The pieces were enough to keep her awake, and they were enough to send her, after a week of reading, to the one person still living who had known August Reyes well. That person was a woman named Esther Vane, who kept a goat farm in the draw below the cemetery, and who had, in her younger years, been August Reyes's housekeeper, and, the town quietly believed, something nearer than that. Esther was past 60, weathered brown as a saddle, with a tongue that had buried more men's reputations than the cemetery above her had buried men. So, she received Della on her porch with great suspicion and a loaded look, a hand resting near the broom she kept by the door for dogs. And worse, and she did not soften until Della set the topmost ledger on the boards between them, and Esther saw the crabbed, honest hand and went very still. The old woman picked it up the way a person picks up something they had long ago made themselves stop hoping for, and she turned the pages slowly, and her thumb stopped on an entry near the front and stayed there a long time before she spoke. "He kept these in the cellar," Esther said at last. Her voice had gone rough. He had your grandfather build that door the last summer he was alive. Said he had something Halloran would kill to burn, and he wanted it behind iron Silas Crane made, because Crane was the only honest man in the county who could build a door. Halloran could not buy his way through. She looked up at Della then, and her eyes were wet and hard at once. August drowned that cellar himself, she said. Diverted the spring into it the week before he died, so no one would ever go down those steps. He meant to come back for it when it was safe. He never got the chance. Della asked how August Reyes had died. Fell from a freight wagon on the Lemhi grade, Esther said in a tone that made plain she had never believed it, and the brake was found cut, and the man who found it was Halloran's man, and the inquest was held by Halloran's friends, and that was the end of August Reyes. She folded her brown hands. I told them, she said. I told the man who sat that inquest that August Reyes never took a drink at his work in 30 years, on those roads, and he wrote down what I said, and then he wrote down what he pleased, and they buried August, a drunk. I always knew there was something he hid. I never knew where. I never thought it would be a girl with a bucket who found it. Stay with this woman a moment, because everything that follows turned on what August Reyes had been brave enough to write down, and what Silas Crane had been honest enough to keep safe. Esther Vane had carried the knowledge of the wrong for 9 years with no proof and no power, and no one who would hear her, and the cost of carrying it had bent her into the hard, suspicious shape that met Della on the porch. The ledger straightened something in her. By the time Della rose to go, the old woman had made up her mind to help, and her help, the local knowledge and the long, unforgiving memory, and the standing of a woman everyone knew did not lie, would prove worth more than any document. What the ledgers held, when Della had read them all and laid them in their order, was the patient record of a theft that had taken 9 years and worn the clothes of the law the whole way. Josiah Halloran had not robbed August Reyes with a gun. He had robbed him with paper. He had bought up the small notes Reyes signed in lean seasons, and called them due in hard winters when no man could pay. He had used his control of the assay scales to undervalue the ore Reyes hauled, so the mines that shipped through Reyes blamed the freighter for short returns and took their business to Halloran's own line. He had quietly purchased the water rights to the springs that fed the freight roads only good, well, and then charged Reyes to water his own teams. And running underneath all of it in entries Reyes had copied painstakingly from documents he should never have been able to see was the thing that would have hanged Josiah Halloran if it ever reached an honest court. Halloran had been salting the assay reports, recording less gold than the ore truly carried, paying the mines the lesser figure, and keeping the difference. For 9 years, from every mine in the district. It was theft on a scale the country had never imagined, and it had been called accounting, and the only man who had gathered the proof of it had been thrown from a wagon on the Lemhi grade and buried as a careless drunk. Della Hart was 18 years old, and she held in a livery loft the ruin of the richest man in the territory, and she understood with a cold clarity that the holding of it was the most dangerous thing she had ever done. She did not go to the sheriff. The sheriff had ridden in the Halloran inquest. She did not go to the bank for obvious reason, nor to the newspaper, whose presses Halloran's loans kept running. She thought about leaving, taking the ledgers and her grandfather's tools, and walking out of the country to some city where a Halloran note meant nothing. She found she could not. Her grandfather had built that door because August Reyes had asked him to keep the truth safe, and the truth had been kept, and now it had been given into her hands. To carry it away and bury it again would be to make her grandfather's last good work into nothing. So she did the thing her grandfather would have done. She read the lock before she touched it. She studied Josiah Halloran the way she had studied the door, looking not at his power but at the man, looking for the maker's path the way in that he himself had left without knowing it. She found it in the ledgers. Reyes had recorded the assay frauds by the assay number, each false report tied to a true weight, and the true weights had been witnessed and recorded in the early years by an assayer Halloran, later ruined, and drove out a man named Cole Ferris, and Reyes had noted in a margin that Ferris kept his own private record, his honest figures. In a tally book he never surrendered. If Cole Ferris still lived, and if the tally book still existed, then Della held not one record but the means to prove it true against a second, and two honest records that agree are a thing no inquest of friends can easily laugh away. Cole Ferris lived. It took her a month of careful asking and the help of Esther Vane's long memory to learn that he had not died but had gone to ground in a played-out mining camp 2 days north, where he made a thin living mending tools and drinking the rest. Della went to him. She took the long ride north on a borrowed mule, with the most damning of the ledgers wrapped in oilcloth against her body, and she found Cole Ferris in a lean-to behind a collapsed stamp mill, a gaunt gray man who had not been sober in years and who, when she said the name Halloran, looked at her as though she had pulled a knife. He told her to leave. He told her there was nothing for her there, and nothing he would say, and that she should ride back the way she came and forget she had ever heard his name. His hands shook as he said it, and not only from the drink, and she saw in the shaking the thing she had come for, because a man who had truly forgotten does not shake. She did not argue with him. She had not come to argue. She did not lecture him. She set the ledger on his rough table and opened it to the assay entries and put her finger on the false figures. And she said only that August Reyes had died keeping these, and that she had spent 6 days emptying a flood by hand to bring them back into the light, and that she believed a man named Cole Ferris had once written the true figures down. Then she was quiet, and she let the lock answer the question in its own time. Ferris wept. It was not a thing she had expected, and it was hard to watch. He had carried the shame of his silence for 9 years, the knowing that he had let himself be frightened and bought into leaving an honest dead man slandered, and the ledger on his table was the first sign in all that time that the truth had not died with Reyes after all. He told her when he could speak how Halloran had done it, the quiet visit, the offer that was also a threat, the suggestion that an assayer with an inconvenient memory might find no work in any camp in the territory and might find worse than that on a dark road. He had been a young man with a young family, and he had folded. And the folding had cost him the family in the end anyway, and the camp, and his name, everything a man trades his honesty to keep. He had the tally book. He had kept it through every hard year, unable to use it and unable to burn it, and he brought it out from under a loose board and put it in her hands, and the figures in it matched the figures Reyes had copied, line for line, mine for mine, the true gold against the false. 2 honest records that agree. Now stay with me, because the way she used what she held is the whole measure of who she was, and it was not the way the men who laughed at her would have used it. She did not take it to a court that Halloran owned, she took it, instead, to the men he had stolen from. Through that long autumn, Della Hart and Cole Ferris, with Esther Vane's farm as their quiet base, made copies in a careful hand of the assay frauds, mine by mine, each company's true losses set against the false reports, and they carried these accountings one at a time to the owners and managers of the mines Halloran had cheated. It was slow and dangerous work. They traveled by back roads and stayed where they were not known, and more than once Della felt the cold prickle of being watched, and did not know whether it was a real watcher or only the fear that 9 years of Halloran's reach had bred into the whole country. They did not stop. Esther kept the original ledgers hidden where no fire and no theft would reach them, and copies went out, and copies are a thing no man can burn faster than an honest hand can write them. Not as accusation, as reckoning. Here is what was taken from you, and here is the proof in 2 records that agree, kept by an honest freighter who died for them, and an honest assayer who survived. Do with it what you judge. Right? What the mine owners judged right was ruin, and they did it the way Halloran himself had taught the country, with paper and with law and with the slow closing of every door. They withdrew their accounts from his bank in a body. They called for an independent assay of the next season's ore, and the figures came back, as Ferris's book had said they would, the true gold standing higher than Halloran's reports by a margin that turned a roomful of hard, practical men cold and quiet. They brought a suit, and because they were powerful men and not a half-starved girl, the suit could not be quietly buried, and the territorial court that took it up was 2 days' ride away and beyond the reach of Halloran's friends. The proof was the ledgers and the tally book, and Della Hart gave her testimony plainly, a girl of 18 explaining to a courtroom how she had known her grandfather's door and found the maker's path and read what the water had failed to drown. She was asked, by a lawyer of Halloran's hiring, how a girl her age could possibly understand an assay ledger, and whether she had not perhaps been put up to the whole tale by interested parties. She answered that she had been raised at a locksmith's bench by a man who held that figures like locks told the truth to anyone patient enough to read them, and that the two records agreed because both were honest, and that an honest record needed no one to put it up to anything, it needed only to be opened. The room was quiet when she finished. Cole Ferris testified after her, sober and steady, and named the day Halloran had come to him and the words Halloran had used, and Esther Vane testified to the cut-break and the rigged inquest. And one by one the small private cruelties that had been called accounting for 9 years were laid out on a table in the light where the whole country could see them. Josiah Halloran was not dragged to any reckoning in the street. He was never shouted at, never struck, never made to answer. Della face to face, he simply began to dissolve. As the truth came out, the country he had built around himself came down, not all at once, but steadily, the way the water had gone out of the cellar, a ring lower each day. His bank failed. His freight contracts were given to others. The story he had built, the poor man who rose by hard, honest work, washed away, and left underneath it the smaller, colder thing he had truly been. He left Cedar Hollow before the snow in a closed coach, and the country that had called him a great man watched him go in silence, and that silence was the only verdict that ever truly mattered to a man like him. Where he went, Della never learned and never troubled to ask. He had stopped being the question that interested her. The estate of August Reyes was reopened. The inquest that had buried him as a careless drunk was set aside, and the record was corrected. And on the small wooden marker in the cemetery above Esther Vane's goats, a freighter who had died for the truth was at last named an honest man. Cole Ferris was made the territorial assayer for the district, sober now and steady, and he held the office with a care that came from knowing exactly what its corruption cost. Esther Vane lived out her years on her farm with the marker of the man she had loved kept honest at last, and she and Della remained, to the end of the old woman's life, the closest of friends. And the shape the town had built around Della Hart, the Hart girl whose father had hanged himself in debt, that shape washed away too, and the country built a new one, harder to argue with, because it was true. She was the locksmith's granddaughter who had read a drowned door and brought down a thief. The men who had laughed at the bucket did not on the whole come to her to apologize, for men of that kind rarely do. They took off their hats now when she passed, and that was apology enough, and she did not need them to say the words. The work had said them. With the small reward the mine owners pressed on her, over her objection. Della did not leave Cedar Hollow, and she did not grow rich. She bought back her grandfather's old shop, which had stood empty since his death, and she hung out a sign that said only Crane and Hart, locksmiths, and she set his bench to rights and laid his tools upon it beside her own, and she opened the door for business. She was good. In a few years she was better than good, and men who would once have crossed the street rather than trust a girl with her strong boxes came to her with their banks and their safes and the locks they could not open, and she opened them, every one, the way she had been taught, by stopping to look at the man who made them. She kept one thing from the cellar that was not hers to sell, and that she would not have sold for any price. It was the small steel hook from her grandfather's roll, the one worn smooth at the grip, which she had carried down those slick stone steps the morning she first stood in the mud and knew his work. She kept it on the bench where her hand fell to it without looking, and on the slow afternoons, when the light came low through the shop window and the town went quiet, she would take it up and turn it in her fingers and remember a hole in the ground that a whole country had called worthless, and the cold breath of air that had come out of the dark when the maker's path gave way, and the voice of an old man telling a girl of 12 that a lock was not a wall, but a question, and that the answer was always there, waiting for the hand patient enough to read it. She was right to buy it. That was the thing she came back to in the low light, turning the hook. $1 and a flood, and the whole town's laughter, and underneath it all, the truth that no water could drown and no rich man could keep. She had not opened the door for the money, and the money had never been the point. She had opened it because her grandfather had taught her that a thing built to keep people out is only a question in iron, and because somewhere down in the cold dark there had been a door, with his hand all over it, asking to be read. What did you keep after the people who taught you were gone, that no one else could see the worth of? Tell it, if you will. And if this is the kind of story that holds you, there is another, like it, waiting, of a thing thrown away that turned out to hold a life.